Hey, do we want to wrap up March reading today? Great, because that's why we're here. I read 12 books and graphic novels over the course of March, and I've honestly talked about a lot of them over the course of the month, whether through Feature Fridays or other videos, so we'll see if that speeds up the process or not. But most of these you can find talked about to further depth if desired, and if not desired, here is a kind of cursory overview, or you can do both. Live your life. I'm surely not going to stop you. But to jump right into it, the first of those titles for the month was VenCo by Cherie Dimaline. This is the author of Empire of Wild, which I have also read, so I was really excited to jump into this book, which was witchier. And I had the sense going in, based on the blurb, that it was going to be looking at witches through the idea of like a tech startup, or kind of centering this idea of a coven around a tech startup. I was completely wrong. And instead it follows our protagonist, Lucky St. James, who's down on her luck a little bit. She's facing eviction from her home, her childhood home, longtime home with her grandmother, due to real estate development, to my recollection. She's in a job she was placed in via a temp agency that is really not a fit, isn't really something she's passionate about. She has an unrequited crush on one of her friends that owns a movie store on the corner near her home, and things are just kind of stagnated for her until she finds this spoon that to her is potentially connected to this urban legend of sorts, that her grandmother, who we know based on the narrative is struggling with mental decline and potential dementia. She had told Lucky some wild tale about someone digging themselves out of the building that used to be next door with a spoon. And so when Lucky finds this while doing laundry, it is something she kind of puts away to think about. However, this spoon is the kind of impetus of everything, oddly enough, and it connects her, or marks her, as the next member of this very specific coven. And we have opened up the story, or the book I should say, with the imagery of the mother, the maiden, and the crone. And within this opening is where we get this kind of company indicator, but they are separate from this idea of the coven and almost operate more as the fates, or a concept of the fates within the book, and are kind of silent actors and can only influence action so much. So Lucky ends up connecting with this coven, and she is the second to last member. And we know, based on the introduction with the mother, the maiden, and the crone, that time becomes shorter in between every members, and they're racing against the clock to kind of assemble this coven, because they are now back on the radar of this last remaining witch hunter that is living out in the desert in California and kind of represents the patriarchy, basically. And there is a history that he has with witches as well, but he is set on eradicating this coven, because there is this sense in the narrative that if they can put together this coven, step into their power in some way, they will have the ability to kind of overthrow typical power structures, or patriarchal power structures. And it definitely does explore the history of persecution of witchcraft, but how men who claim to be hunters of witches, or witch hunters, the easier way to say that, often employ similar tactics or step into similar realms, but don't consider themselves witches, and so the gender politics of all of it. So they're racing against the clock to find the final member of this coven, this final spoon, with this witch hunter on their tail. And it's a kind of road trip in some ways, because there's this network of helpers for these witches that they're kind of going to for information. Honestly, I think I compared this to it in my Feature Friday as well. And again, caveat that I'm not a video game player, but it almost felt like they were kind of going to these people for exposition in the same way that you would get information from like a side character in a tavern in a game, or like that being the kind of stereotypical idea of how you would gather that information. And as I also said in the Feature Friday, it's this kind of mix of feeling both slow and fast-paced at the same time. It's very exposition heavy. We are getting the backstory of all these characters, of all these members of the coven, which is almost the extent of their character development for some of these characters in some way. But then we are kind of not looking at the final picture. We don't know what this sense of this final showdown, the stakes of this final showdown really are. We know the amorphous stakes. We know this idea, this concept of overthrowing the patriarchy, whatever that means, but we don't know the real sense of the power of this coven, or what that means. And we don't really see them using magic beyond like scrying. We don't have the sense of the breadth of the magic, the breadth of their power. We're not seeing them really step into their power in that way. We're seeing them on the defensive. However, the tone of the book is kind of quippy and almost tongue-in-cheek sarcastic sarcastic, and that kind of hides a lot of that exposition within that tone because it gives the illusion of moving fast, even if we're still in kind of an exposition space, which I think is a really smart solution for that narrative hurdle. Now, it may not be completely on purpose, but I like to think it is, especially because the tone does differ pretty significantly from Empire of Wild. So it shows that Dimaline is making very specific choices in terms of the tone, and also indicates that the tone may be playing into the larger thematic explorations of the book, even if I don't know that I'm really equipped to unpack that thought. And even if I don't know that the book really knew how it wanted to land this thematically, I think that there were still some really important thematic and emotional buttons to the book, and I think it was really satisfying. Like I said, there was this kind of cat and mouse chase to everything, so it was very action focused after a certain point, even if the action was kind of a stand-in for these larger kind of sometimes potentially heavy-handed thematic ideas. Was I disappointed on some level that this wasn't an exploration of witchcraft within the concept of a startup? Yes, because I'm very interested in kind of the modern conception of witchcraft and the way that witches in the kind of current moment have been taken in a way in some avenues that feels a little bit more capitalistic. And I do think that on some level, this book was aiming to explore the community of everything, because we were centered on this idea of coven, which is again too why we got all of these backstories for all of the women within the coven. So I think that there was on some level this engagement with this kind of modern idea of witches. It just wasn't what I was expecting based on my interpretation of the blurb, but that's okay, and I 100% probably just misinterpreted the blurb in favor of what I kind of wanted. So even if I don't know that this landed everything perfectly, it was still a fun ride and still an interesting exploration of witchcraft through the lens of the current moment. And then I reread Daisy Jones and the Six to prepare to watch the show. When I first read this, I read this on audio, so I was very interested to see how my reading experience, my physical reading experience, would differ from my audio experience, because I personally think this is one of the best audiobook productions I've listened to, especially for fiction. And once your ear kind of catches on to whose voice is who, it helps things flow a lot more smoothly. And then you're getting these words through the person's voice specifically, because this book is told, if you don't know, through interviews. And so it's looking back on this very famous band from the 70s that kind of had this really big moment and then kind of exploded or imploded based on your interpretation of the material or maybe your viewing of the show. I would argue that the book is a little bit more explosion and the show is a little bit more implosion. Not a judgment on that, just an observation and purely my interpretation. But what I find really interesting in the book, and what I think is a strength of the book, is because you are framing everything around these interviews, you are having to read between the lines a lot. You're having to decide which characters you can trust in a completely new way, kind of having to approach people's narrative inclinations in a new way. What would be someone's motivation for holding something back? What kind of perception, or how do they want to present themselves to the world? What is the final product of this, or who are they talking to? We don't know until the end, which kind of helps shift the perception of everything that has come before. But we have these moments of dramatic irony in some cases where some characters will know information that others don't. So hearing the kind of misconceptions or the conclusions they've come to with only half the picture are really kind of funny sometimes, but also makes you kind of question, is everyone telling you the truth at all times? Who are you going to believe? What makes the most sense in every circumstance? And what is the subtext, or what is being read in between the lines of everything? And it also is interesting because we're looking at the kind of private behind the public. And so we're looking at the undercurrent of this art and what maybe is the charge running through all of this art that lives larger than them. And in many ways, it's this exploration and deconstruction of these very broken people, which I think is what the show has kind of pulled out the most, or what it clung onto, without fully exploring their brokenness, because these characters in this book are very messy, and the book gets a lot messier than I feel like the show really does. We explore a Daisy and Billy that are much more entangled with their addictions, and it makes those a lot more present and dangerous in a way that I'm still kind of struggling with the interpretation of in the show, because it was definitely still shown but I almost feel like they pulled back in an attempt to make Daisy and Billy more likable in some ways, and also potentially not to glamorize their kind of downward spiral in other ways. However, I do think that by pulling back, we have glamorized it more in actuality, and also it's taken away a lot of the noise and the danger from things. Because in the book, even though we are talking about these very specific events and we see these quotes being cut to the very specific events and to the straight narrative, we do get a sense of what these characters are struggling with. This idea of what Billy is kind of running from and what maybe pushes him into places within his first kind of battle with addiction. But we also have these moments, like I talked about in my exploration of the first half of the season, where early in the book we talk about their former drummer dying in Vietnam. There is a real danger, and we have this sense of the ephemera of everything from the very beginning. So it makes everything a lot more present and pertinent, while also mirroring that a lot of these moments are fleeting. And the nature of art, the nature of music is fleeting in some way. It is that one moment. It's that one moment on stage, but then how does that one moment on stage transcend into legend? And what does that mean? And what is the story behind the legend? And what do we as outsiders project on it versus the actuality of the thing? And it's especially interesting to kind of explore in this moment of stan culture and how we have so much more access to artists now and how these stories get told and what stories are told. But all that aside, I think that the uniqueness of the storytelling here within the interview format really serves it, especially because we have these moments where we realize at some point who we are or are not hearing from and how that plants seeds for what may come down the line in terms of the story. And the way that that sets expectations for us as readers, we build out the story that we think is being told and then how that shifted a little bit. So even as readers, we're being kind of conned into building these narratives around these things. And where I think that the structure still works better in the book is that we seem to get a little bit more insight, I would argue, into these characters through the interviews within the book. I liked that the interviews were kept for the show, obviously, but it feels like there's a little bit more emotional honesty and rawness within the book. These characters are willing to reflect on themselves and their circumstances in a different way. So I don't know, it is what it is. I will say there are a bunch of lyrics within the back of the book. And so much of the book really explores this quest to lock down this album, to make this album perfect, this idea of the perfect order, how everything went into the songwriting. And I felt like I lost a little bit of that in the show, and they definitely changed the music. A lot of the songs that are referenced specifically in the book aren't even on the album, and songs like Honeycomb specifically are changed pretty drastically. So there is a different kind of intention to that music. And I'm not saying that the music in the book or like the lyrics that are written in the book are like the be-all end-all of this emotional journey by any means. But I don't know. I think the lyric in the show that really catches my ear or kind of jars my ear the most is the use of the word dude in Regret Me, which I know is completely appropriate for the time period. It makes absolute sense. But within the context of that song, particularly for me right now, and the song will probably grow on me and become a favorite admittedly, it feels like that word is being a little forced into the song to be like, remember, it's the 70s, instead of feeling more organically rooted in the emotion. But that's just me right now, and I am not a poet or a songwriter. So then moving on and kind of circling back to the ideas in VenCo, I read White Magic, or should I say Listen to White Magic by Alyssa Washuta. This is an essay collection that explores grief, abuse, spirituality, connection to one's ancestral cultural lineage. It is admittedly not exactly what I was expecting and a lot heavier than I was expecting because it is a very personal look at this woman's journey and essays centered around her life and personal experience. So I honestly went in expecting an exploration of white appropriation and co-opting of native spiritual practices and traditions for this modern idea of spirituality, and a spirituality that I am honestly seeing all over, especially TikTok, but it's hard to recognize, at least for me who has never been kind of rooted in any of this brand of spirituality or these practices. anyone's real connection to these practices. You know, what is actual spiritual belief and what is a grift? But both stealing these practices is a problem. So I was honestly expecting more exploration of that. So that's definitely not what I got. And I can't be mad for what it is because it is someone's raw personal experience. So even though it wasn't what I expected going in, it is still something I would definitely recommend in terms of personal narrative, because there is a real bravery in being that emotionally raw and honest. So definitely something to check out, but recognize that it is pretty heavy. So just that warning off the top. And then I read the most kind of gothic feeling book of the month for me, which was The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chakshi. I, of course, did talk about this in a Feature Friday, my 100th Feature Friday, I believe. And this follows a young couple who we see meet and then kind of follow into their honeymoon phase. And then they have to go back to the bride's childhood home where there are secrets. And she tells the bridegroom, whose point of view we do get, but we don't get Indigo, the bride's point of view. She tells him not to go digging for answers to things here. And so we've seen them living in this kind of in-between in a lot of ways. They live within the realm of these stories. There's a lot of kind of role play to their relationship and taking on these personas. And the bridegroom is a student of fairy tales. So he is able to kind of deconstruct a lot of these stories and kind of tie things together for us, because we really are exploring a lot of story types here. And one of the first stories we're introduced to early in the narrative is the idea of Eros and Psyche. So we have some indication that we are going to be seeing some truth to one of these characters, presumably the character whose point of view we're not in, and our other protagonist, our other love interest, is going to have to take some action based on that they may turn away initially, but what's the next step? So there is this sense of danger to things and this sense that something is hidden. And as we traverse this house and get deeper into the past and Indigo's secrets, we learn of her childhood best friend Azur, who she was as close as a sister to, and whose point of view we start to see in the past. So we start to see this kind of weaving of the tale. We see things unfolding in the past, and then we see the reflection in the present of the bridegroom either learning this information or kind of viewing things through the lens of fairy tales and kind of unpacking this thematic exploration, and everything feeling a little foggy, a little dangerous. I definitely went in with some sense of potentially like Bluebeard to this, which doesn't really pay off, but there is that sense of danger, that sense that you are in this space and you're not supposed to go looking, and why. And then it's about seeing the person you're with, learning the truth of them, and whether or not you can accept that. So this book is very lyrical, really kind of playing into Chakshi's narrative strengths, and it unfolds like a fairy tale. It is told like a fairy tale. So there is a lot of kind of broad strokes thematic exploration in some ways. We have these characters that are kind of stand-ins and representations. We don't necessarily learn the whole truth of them. They are still very enigmatic in some ways, but that fits within the story being told. And there's also these layers to the idea of story and where we hide in story, especially in the past, how Azur and Indigo are kind of fleeing reality into this kind of make-believe fairy realm that they've created. And as they get older and kind of interact with this idea of this world differently, and one of them wants to start going out into the real world and what that means. But also in the present, we have the bridegroom who has a tragedy in his past, sadness to his past. He had a brother who he knows died, but his parents tell him never existed. And he has been really grappling with this and seeking answers through stories, sure that if he finds the right fairy tale, he can unlock the secret to what happened to his brother and what is going on. And so we have these kind of layers of hiding in story, but also the way that stories can illuminate the truth and reveal the truth of a person kind of to their core in some ways. So in case you couldn't tell, I adored this book. I admittedly haven't read all of Chakshi's work, but this aligned for me personally closest to the Star Touch Queen, which is also where I fell in love with her work because of the lyricism of her language. And so I think that she is able to really tap into that idea of myth and legend and fairy tale so expertly, and I loved seeing the way that language was explored here. And then to kind of look at language from a different point of view, I reread Cultish by Amanda Montell for book club. I did this through audiobook this time because it was, for me at least, available as a Hoopla download. And I have been wanting my book club to read this for some time because I expected it to be great conversation, and it was. I had some book club members like me who were super enthusiastic about it, some a little bit more hesitant about the kind of broad strokes nature of the narrative, which was part of the reason I was so excited to talk about it, because I was really excited and engaged with the ideas of the book, even if I don't know that the execution was 100%, because it was a little broad strokes. But this book talks about the language of cults and kind of the idea of cults on a broader scale, and how different avenues of our lives may have different levels of kind of cultish behavior in terms of the way that we maneuver and manipulate language and the kind of in-group conversations that develop. But that in-group conversations and language in and of itself isn't necessarily a warning sign. You have to look at some of these other indicators, but this was definitely going to be focused in on the language. So it presents it as a spectrum and starts with like the most culty, which is like Jonestown, and then moves down to like your Instagram influencers. Just this kind of adoption of language within different groups. And I think that that is kind of a human instinct anyway, but I was really fascinated by especially the introduction for me of things like thought-terminating cliches, these kind of conversation stoppers within groups like this, and I wish that it had almost gone into the language a little more in depth. I talked about having listened to it this time because I read it the first time, even though I tend to prefer to listen to books like this, because I was convinced we were going to be deconstructing the language a lot more than it did. And in some ways, this reread kind of reiterated for me kind of how broad the exploration was here. I really would have liked to kind of zoom in on both a more central thesis or the language more specifically. Because if the language is the thesis, which I think it is, I think we could have deconstructed it a little bit more, and I think we also could have drawn more parallels and connections between the sections, and looking, especially as we kind of move down this spectrum of malevolence, where the kind of danger is and where the language starts moving into more manipulative territory or whatever. So I recommend this book, and I've definitely enjoyed it both times I've listened to it, but I'm really excited to see how the conversation continues to evolve around these topics, and I think we are seeing a lot more interest both in cults as we know them, which we've always kind of seen interest in, but some of the different shades of cult that we see within the book. But definitely interesting to see, and we will see how that conversation continues to evolve. And then I read I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Mackay, which is overdue at the library, and we will be returning today, but was potentially the most compulsively readable of 2023 new releases I've read so far this year, but also a book that left me wanting in some ways. I was very, very excited for this book. The Great Believers still haunts me, as I mentioned in my feature Friday for this one. Additionally, Mackay is a local author, and I have seen her in conversation with a lot of authors. I would argue that she is probably one of the best moderators I have seen in Chicago. I've seen her in conversation with R.O. Kwan, I've seen her in conversation with authors like Julia Fine, and a couple of years ago at Printers Row Lit Fest, she was moderating a panel about like weird fiction. I can't remember the name of the actual panel. I'm sorry. However, she had indicated that she wasn't super interested in straightforward storytelling anymore. So I was so interested to see how she was going to attack this book and how experimental it was going to be potentially, because admittedly, I really do like that kind of weird experimental fiction in a lot of ways. And while this did play with form in some ways because there was a big time jump, it was pretty straightforward, I would argue, narratively in some ways, which isn't a bad thing, just not necessarily what I was expecting going in based on that conversation. Not that anyone should be locked into artistic direction based on an offhand comment one time, to be clear. So this book follows our protagonist, Bodhi, as she is going back to the boarding school she attended in the 90s to lead this podcasting seminar. But since her time as a student, she has been kind of haunted by the murder of one of her former classmates and her former roommate when she was a senior. And this case has kind of lurked in the back of her head, and she has indicated within the narrative how it kind of lives in infamy on these internet forums. And even though someone was put away for the crime, is doing time for the crime, there is this question of whether he is the one who committed the crime. And there are very firm opinions on both sides of the fence. And so we see her kind of stepping in to this exploration. And while she insists that she is not leading, or she wasn't leading her students into this exploration, the narrative kind of implies that she did. And it is told from her point of view, so we are are definitely seeing things through her perspective, and that's going to color things. Additionally, in terms of the point of view, the most kind of experimental the book gets is that she is writing to somebody. She is directly aiming this narrative and this story at someone who isn't the reader. And we do find out who that someone is, because within the framing of the narrative, this kind of reopening of this case really indicated to me going in that we were going to be focused on this exploration of true crime. And I do think that a lot of the kind of buzz leading up to the release really focused on this exploration, this complication, this critique of true crime in its modern moment. However, as much as this is an exploration of true crime to an extent, and this idea of Bodhi kind of inserting herself into this narrative, this idea of anyone inserting themselves into these narratives and who has the right to or not. Does Bodhi have a right based on the fact that she knew this girl versus like this popular YouTuber that she watches that is constantly talking about the case? Whose story is this? And do motivations matter when there is evidence that there has been a miscarriage of justice? What does justice look like? All of that exploration, which really got to the heart of what I was expecting on some level. However, this was also much more a Me Too novel than I was expecting. And in some ways, I would argue that it may be more of a Me Too novel than a true crime novel, which sounds odd because everything is centered around this case, but they are so intrinsically linked, especially because the Me Too lens and exploration, Bodhi seeing her time at school much differently as an adult, is how the crime and the exploration, the reopening of this exploration of this crime is being framed. So they are definitely in conversation with one another. And even amidst all of these bigger overarching explorations, as I've mentioned before, I think one of Makai's biggest strengths as an author is her exploration of these flawed characters. She builds out really complex people that we aren't always necessarily rooting for, even if we're seeing things through their eyes. So there's this real sense of depth to these people, and this also breeds a little bit of uncertainty, especially because within this genre, mystery, true crime, what have you, there is this impetus, I would argue, toward wanting some kind of moral certitude. We kind of want to seek out those answers. And in a lot of ways, the characterizations in the novel kind of pulls back from that moral certitude. Now, because of this complication, I was a little surprised in that it felt like we got more answers toward the end than I was expecting. We weren't, 100%, because the exploration is kind of interrogating the flaws of the justice system in a lot of ways. So we don't necessarily see justice fully done as we would conceive of it. However, as a reader, I got a sense of resolution. I had a sense that the narrative told me what the truth of the matter was, which was honestly a lot more than I was expecting, especially as I was considering this a kind of complication of the genre. And some of those answers felt like they came kind of suddenly, especially as a lot of this had been a lot more ponderings and kind of reflections. And as I said in the Feature Friday as well, one of the strengths I found of this book, or where I found the book really excelled the most, was kind of this reframing of the school days. And so the fact that we got a little bit more certainty in the present both made sense and didn't. So regardless, even though I felt the ending was a little rushed potentially, or kind of undermined some of the exploration and complication that we had built up earlier in the novel, even amidst all of this, this book was incredibly readable, partly, like I said, because of the full flawed characters that Makai builds out, but also because of that reframing and that kind of re-exploration of what we know, and that kind of contrast against school days, and not just school days, but school days in the 90s, school days at the time of payphones, which now feel a whole world away. So definitely still one I would recommend, even if it takes a slightly different approach than I was expecting and engages with different conversations than I was expecting, but still worth your time, and like I said, compulsively readable. And then I read volume 3 of Lore Olympus by Rachel Smith. I admittedly don't really have much to say about this. I'm enjoying it. I'm going along for the ride. I will be continuing this series, but I don't know that I have many opinions. I'm obviously enjoying it because I'm continuing, but it still feels like we're in this exposition lead up. I am very interested to see Hades and Persephone get together. I know that this is being released online through Webtoon, so I don't know how far ahead that is and where the story sits online versus in these volumes. but I'll keep going this route and look forward to volume 4 that comes out later this year, I believe. And then I read The Wicked Bargain by Gabe Novoa as part of the Trans Rights Readathon, and because it was already on my TBR. This follows a young pirate Mar as their entire crew is lost to a storm, but not just any storm, a storm born of a deal with the devil that their father had made at birth to save them and gain notoriety, and when their father's deal comes due, they are left shipwrecked. But they are rescued by another pirate crew at kind of the end of the Age of Pirates. However, they are then forced to hide their magic. This magic brings the devil back around to offer Mar a deal to get their father back. And then there are also the politics of pirates, revolutionaries, and the Spanish occupying at this time. So there's a lot going on here, but it is ultimately a book about stepping into your power, stepping into yourself, with a little sprinkling of flirting on the side, because a little flirting never hurt anybody, whether you recognized it or not. Also, don't take that as a blanket statement. You know what I mean, it's welcome flirting, but I've talked about this a couple of times, both in a Feature Friday and in my wrap-up for the Trans Rights Readathon, so if you like young adult and pirates, I would definitely recommend picking this one up. And then I read Drag Me Up by R.M. Virtues, which is a spicier Hades and Persephone retelling perfect for fans of Katie Roberts. This takes place in Chaos Falls, which feels kind of Vegas-y, or at least Hades territory feels kind of Vegas-y. And we have a Hades who's kind of the underlying power behind his brother Zeus, and is always kind of cleaning up Zeus's messes. However, at the beginning of the book, Zeus has kind of put them in a really awkward political position by kind of backing out of a promise. So he's already kind of frustrated, and then he goes to the opening of this new show that is being put forward by his adopted son Dionysus. And at that show, which is kind of Cirque du Soleil, Persephone is the main performer and the star, the breakout, and catches Hades' eye right away. And so they're drawn together. However, Persephone also has a history with Zeus. She kind of escaped out from under her mother's wing to pursue this passion and to pursue her art, and she was able to do this thanks to a scholarship to a drama school. However, Zeus was behind the scholarship, and he is using this kind of as leverage against her and harassing her. And when she's kind of connected with Hades, he understandably does not like this, however trusts Persephone and tries to give Persephone her own agency and space. However, this is another mark against Zeus in Hades' book and gives him the kind of power to fight back, but also forces him to kind of face where he has enabled Zeus and this behavior in the past. So this leads to a kind of shakeup between the two brothers and a kind of re-centralizing of power within Chaos Falls, but most importantly, it leads to a very steamy love between Hades and Persephone. So I'm definitely interested in the rest of the series and think that you should definitely check it out too if any of that sounds interesting to you, or you like steamy retellings of Greek myths, but definitely something to have on your radar. And then I read Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, which I've also talked about a couple of times, and follows identity and motherhood and centers the trans experience. And one of the things that I loved most about this novel is that it explored really messy, flawed characters in a really realistic way, and it succeeded at what I think a lot of books are trying to do with their messier, flawed characters that often feels like added shock value in some narratives, and here everything felt very grounded to these people and real, and instead it was raw and emotionally honest in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable because of the depth of that honesty. And so it succeeded in that discomfort naturally in a way that I think often narratives are trying to force the reader into some kind of discomfort, but it doesn't feel emotionally grounded. Like I said, it often feels like it's shock value, or that's how it ends up reading because that emotional grounding doesn't necessarily feel there. And of course that's a spectrum, and what might not read as emotionally resonant or grounded to me in some narratives is going to resonate incredibly well with others. So all of that with a grain of salt, but I did think that this was an incredibly successful narrative. It engaged in a lot of high concept conversation and ideas through its exploration of its characters and didn't feel too preachy. It didn't feel like it was necessarily offering us easy answers or giving us an answer. Rather, it was presenting these characters and we were kind of muddling through it with them. So I think that there was a lot of strength in it. I think that there's a reason this has been such a breakout hit, and I think it's well deserved. So if you haven't read it yet, I would encourage you to pick it up. However, also recognize that that emotional messiness, that emotional vulnerability may lead to some discomfort in reading, especially for cis readers. characters, but that discomfort is important because that means that you are engaging with the ideas actively. So it is a discomfort that brings about real thought. And like I said, I think all of that is accomplished based on the strength of the characters, because I definitely think that this is a character-driven novel, but definitely one you should check out. And how many more times can I say definitely? Probably a lot. Moving on, I read She is a Haunting by Trang Van Tran. This is the book I read most recently for Feature Friday. It follows Jade, a young woman kind of in between high school and college, as she goes to visit her father in Vietnam. Well, she goes with her mother to visit her mother's family, but she's made to deal with her father, who the family is estranged from and who is in the process of renovating this old French colonial home in Vietnam for tourists. And she has agreed that if she goes to live with him for 4 to 5 weeks and helps build a website for this house, that he will pay for her first year of college, because she doesn't want to ask her mother for more help because she feels like her mother has sacrificed enough. And even though it is not explicitly said in the text, there is this sense that he owes her for having left them. And there's definitely this anger and resentment from Jade directed at her father, and also this idea that she is also grappling with her own identity. But wouldn't you know it, the house is also angry and haunted, so she has to deal with that haunting and trying to get her family out, trying to warn them of the danger that they don't recognize and what happens there. So like I said in Feature Friday, if you like angry girls and angry ghosts, this is a book for you. And then finally, I read Extraordinary, which is a graphic novel entry in B.E. Schwab's Villain series. I had forgotten this existed. I found it while looking for Fence Volume 5 at the library. I did not succeed in finding Fence Volume 5, even though it was supposed to be there. I asked, hey, is there another place this may be? Because I understand things get jumbled. And they're like, no, that's the only place it would be. The easiest thing to do would probably be to put a hold on it. And I was like, that sounds like a great idea if I had holds. So I walked out without Fence Volume 5, but I did get this. I'll admit, I didn't really like this. I didn't love the illustrations of Eli and Victor, though admittedly it's probably in a style that more aligns with their kind of impetus and roots. I didn't love that so much of the graphic novel was kind of the exposition backstory of Eli and Victor, which I get that we have to introduce, but then Charlotte's story in here is really rushed. I will be interested because I don't remember Charlotte from book 2, though it's been a second since I've read either of the books. So if you remember her, let me know, because this is listed as 1.5 within the series on Goodreads. So I don't remember her showing up. I don't know if she's a character that will get a more fleshed out story in the books. I believe there is a 3rd book coming now. So I will be interested to know if we learn more about her. But here, this just felt like a kind of introductory backstory, not like anything fully developed. And it doesn't look like there are more books or graphic novels for her story in particular coming, so I'll be interested to see that. I was interested in her power, which is the ability to see how someone is going to die reflected, and I did really enjoy how that was illustrated within the graphic novel, but otherwise, I don't know. I guess it didn't really leave me feeling too strongly one way or the other, but it was a quick read, so it's not like I'm out anytime. That was all of March. Yet again, I'm tired of my own voice, so we're gonna wrap this up. Let me know what you read in March and what you feel strongly about one way or the other. Let me know if you read any of what I've read and whether you feel strongly about any of those titles one way or the other. But either way, thanks for hanging out as usual and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.